Hello, everyone, and welcome to a deeper look into crime. Today, we're stepping past the yellow police tape and looking through the eyes of a criminal profiler. We're going to explore the architecture of chaos itself, the psychological and behavioral typologies that help law enforcement decode the darkest corners of human behavior. Imagine standing in a room where a violent crime has just occurred. To the untrained eye, it's nothing but a snapshot of pure devastation, complete chaos. But what does a silent crime scene whisper to a trained detective? Is there a hidden logic beneath the violence? The truth is, every single action an offender takes, or doesn't take for that matter, leaves a psychological fingerprint. By analyzing these physical clues, investigators can start to build a remarkably accurate profile of the phantom they're hunting. Section 1. The Profiler's Puzzle.
Now, to truly understand this tool, we have to look back at its origins. Criminal behavior analysis requires a solid framework. Back in the 1970s, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit began pioneering research into the minds of the worst of the worst. By the late 70s, agents like Robert Ressler, John Douglas, and Ann Burgess were doing the unthinkable. They were walking straight into maximum security prisons to interview convicted serial killers face-to-face. They analyzed crime scene reconstructions, cross-referenced them with these interviews, and by the 1980s, they finalized a revolutionary framework. This new system categorized offenders heavily by their level of planning, control, and social competence.
Section 2. The Organized Mind. When we delve into the psychological profile of the organized offender, we're usually looking at clinical psychopathy. This is a condition defined by a profound lack of empathy, intense narcissism, and highly manipulative behavior. But what's genuinely chilling about this psychology is what it means for society at large. These individuals are socially competent. They might have a steady job, a spouse, a circle of friends. They possess this terrifying ability to seamlessly blend into everyday life, making them incredibly difficult for law enforcement to detect. So, how does a psychopathic profile actually manifest at a crime scene? Well, the crucial point here is control. Organized offenders exhibit a high level of premeditation. They don't just snap, they strategize. They deliberately select their targets, often strangers, but chosen for a very specific reason. They bring their own tools and weapons to the scene, essentially a kill kit, and they use restraints to maintain absolute dominance. Plus, because of their above-average intelligence, they are acutely aware of forensic detection. They'll actively try to minimize evidence. They might clean the scene, alter it, or transport the body to a secondary location. Some even obsessively follow media coverage of their own crimes just to stay one step ahead of the police. A textbook example of this typology is Ted Bundy. Bundy weaponized his charm and his intellect to lure victims into a false sense of security. He meticulously planned his attacks, carefully disposed of evidence, and used his social competence to completely evade law enforcement for years. He perfectly encapsulates the organized predatory mindset. Section 3. The Disorganized Mind. But what happens when there's absolutely no plan? The psychological engine driving a disorganized offender is completely different. Instead of psychopathy, we're often looking at severe emotional disturbance or even outright psychosis. We're talking about a state of profound psychological instability, sometimes accompanied by cognitive impairment or developmental issues. Unlike the organized offender who holds down a steady job, the disorganized offender suffers from below-average social functioning. They struggle profoundly with basic employment, daily routines, and maintaining any kind of relationships. Their minds are in a constant chaotic state of turmoil. And when that internal turmoil boils over into violence, the crime scene reflects it perfectly. Disorganized crimes feature little to no premeditation. The victim selection is entirely random, literally just a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because they don't plan, they obviously don't bring a kit with them. They use weapons of opportunity found right at the scene, maybe a rock from the garden or a kitchen knife left on the counter. The resulting crime scenes are incredibly chaotic, messy, and characterized by excessive, frenzied violence. They strike suddenly, act completely impulsively, and usually leave a massive amount of physical evidence behind, often including the body, right where the initial attack happened. To ground this disorganized theory in reality, consider the devastating case of Richard Chase, dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento. Chase's actions were driven by severe, unchecked psychological delusions. He displayed erratic behavior, absolutely zero planning, and a shocking level of extreme brutality. He chose houses simply because the doors were left unlocked. It represents the ultimate tragic randomness of the disorganized offender. When we look at these two typologies side by side, the dichotomy is stark. you can really see how differently their minds process the commission of a crime. We're looking at the above average intelligence of the organized versus the below average of the disorganized. A clean, deliberately altered scene stacked up against a wildly chaotic one. Weapons brought to the scene purposefully versus weapons just found by chance at the scene. And finally, the socially competent predator, standing in sharp contrast to the socially impaired, impulsive attacker.
Section 4. The blurred lines.
Now, as any seasoned detective will tell you, human behavior rarely fits perfectly into a neat little box. So what happens when a crime scene tells two completely different stories? Well, modern criminology recognizes what we call the mixed offender. Imagine an individual who meticulously stalks a victim and successfully executes a highly planned abduction. That's a classic organized trait. But during the commission of the crime, the victim fights back unexpectedly. The offender loses control, panics, and commits a chaotic, highly impulsive killing, leaving behind a messy scene and even the murder weapon. Those are classic disorganized traits. This kind of blend highlights the immense, challenging complexity of behavioral analysis.
Section 5. Catching the killer.
So how do detectives actually use all this theory in the field? One of the most fascinating applications is geographic profiling. By determining if an offender is organized or disorganized, investigators can actually start to narrow down where the killer might live. Because organized offenders are methodical and highly mobile, they're willing and able to travel much further distances to hunt and to dispose of evidence. Disorganized offenders, on the other hand, are constrained by poor social functioning and sheer impulsivity, so they tend to stay right in their comfort zones, striking much closer to their own homes. This behavioral analysis also directly shapes the tactics used once a suspect is actually in custody. Picture the interrogation room. Step 1 is analyzing the crime scene to determine that offender type. If the suspect is deemed organized, detectives know they're dealing with someone highly manipulative and intelligent, so they'll use strategic, evidence-based questioning, slowly backing the suspect into a logical corner. But if the suspect is disorganized, the entire strategy flips. Investigators might apply heavy emotional confrontation and pressure, knowing this specific type of offender is psychologically unstable and significantly more likely to break under that kind of stress.
Section 6. The future of profiling. While the FBI's original model undoubtedly laid the groundwork, the science of investigation is constantly evolving. Despite its widespread historical use, modern criminologists have some very valid criticisms of this original dichotomy. First off, it oversimplifies incredibly complex human behavior and lacks really strong empirical statistical validation. Modern researchers argue that criminal behavior exists on a fluid spectrum, not in rigid binary boxes. The biggest danger here is misinterpretation. A chaotic crime scene might not necessarily mean the killer's clinically disorganized or psychotic. It might simply reflect situational panic from an organized offender whose plan just went terribly wrong. Relying on rigid classifications can sometimes completely mislead an active investigation.
Because of these limitations, contemporary criminal justice is shifting. We're seeing a really powerful evolution toward data-driven methods, specifically behavioral evidence analysis, or BEA, and broader investigative psychology. Instead of forcing an unknown offender into a pre-existing psychological profile, these modern approaches heavily emphasize the physical evidence, statistics, and empirical data over rigid typologies. It ensures a much more objective, scientific hunt for the truth. The organized versus disorganized framework remains a legendary foundational tool in criminal history, but it does leave us with a lingering, provocative thought. If a crime scene is really just a snapshot of chaos, influenced by sudden panic, circumstance, and environment, can we ever truly map the darkest corners of the human mind? The relentless pursuit of that answer is exactly what drives the future of criminology.
Comment your thoughts on this explainer. Also, subscribe to us to see more explainers like this in the future. See you in the next explainer.